let's proceed. Call your next witness.
The defense called Dr. Chris Coggins. State your name and address, please.
Christopher Richard Emerson Coggins. I live at 220 Carson Watts Road in King, North Carolina.
But you are British, right?
Yes, sir.
Born and raised in England?
That's right.
Educated in Scotland?
That's right.
And living and working in the United States since when?
Since August of '85.
For whom do you work, Dr. Coggins?
I work for the Lorillard Tobacco Company in Greensboro.
That's a defendant in this case.
I believe so, yes.
And since when?
I've worked for Lorillard since December the 1st, 1996.
So that's about 9 months.
I believe about 9 months.
What's your job with Lorillard?
I'm a Senior Vice President of Science and Technology.
I'm sorry, science what?
Science and Technology.
And there's a mic there in front of you, too. If you lean forward just a little bit.
I see.
Pick up better. Would you tell the jury what your duties are, please, as the Senior Vice President of Science and Technology?
Certainly. I have three main commitments. The first is to set medium and long-term goals for research and development. The second is to continue my previous position with RJ Reynolds, where my task was to understand the published literature on the general smoking health, but specifically on environmental tobacco smoke. And then the third position is to maintain positions on technical external committees that Lorillard sits on.
And are you pretty well into these duties? You still learning them, or what's the status?
I'm very much still learning. I've been there, as you say, not quite 9 months. Some I've made advances in, and some, quite frankly, I haven't.
But you were with tobacco before this?
That's right.
Okay, we'll go into that a little bit more in a moment. I've got your resume, and if I'm asking you something about it and you've forgotten, I can always give you a copy, but for the moment I'll just work from the resume. You let me know if there's a problem.
Thank you.
Would you describe for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury your education, starting, I think, with what we call the bachelor's degree level in this country?
I obtained a bachelor's degree from the University of Glasgow in Scotland in 1972. As part of that bachelor's degree, I performed an extra year, which was a research year, to produce an honors degree, which is kind of similar to the master's degree here, not quite as advanced, but I obtained a bachelor's degree with honors. As part of my research, doing my bachelor's degree, I met a scientist at the University of Edinburgh, and he helped me write my thesis. When I'd finished my bachelor's degree, he called me and said, would I go and work for him at the University of Edinburgh in a place called the Animal Diseases Research Association to get my PhD. I did. I was very flattered and went to the University of Edinburgh in 1972 and obtained my PhD from the Faculty of Sciences of the University of Edinburgh in 1976.
Are you a toxicologist?
I'm a board-certified toxicologist, yes.
We'll get to the board certification in a minute, but and I'll tell you, Doctor, you don't need to go into this in great detail because the jury has just heard from a witness talking in part about toxicology, but would you give us your working definition of what a toxicologist is?
I think a toxicologist is someone who studies the adverse effects of foreign compounds on the body.
All right. Now, you said you were board certified. Is that the American Board of Toxicology?
That's right.
Okay. How did you get the board certification? What did you do?
First of all, to be eligible to take the exam, it's an examination you have to take, you have to prove that you are a practicing toxicologist before they'll even let you take the exam. And you have to have been practicing as a toxicologist for at least 3 years.
Is that a written exam?
Yes, sir.
Okay, excuse me, go ahead.
The examination, that once you submit your credentials, they say, yes, you're eligible, or no, you're not. I was eligible because at the time I'd been doing toxicology studies for approximately 10 years. Then I sat the examination, which covers many of the different disciplines of toxicology, and you have to pass each discipline within the examination. So I passed that examination in 1986 and was declared board certified as of that moment. However, this society is rather stringent that they require you resit the exam every 5 years. So I sat it again in 1991 and again in 1996 and passed both of those exams again. The final statement I would make is that the American Board of Toxicology not only requires you to maintain eligibility at all times, they require you to submit exams to the board themselves so that other people can learn from your questions.
You mean you submit questions that, suggested questions for other people?
The American Board of Toxicology clearly can't keep asking the same questions all the time, so they request board certified members to submit as many questions as they can into their central database.
Now, you list a number of societies on your resume. I won't ask you about all of them. Just tell us which are the more important ones.
Probably the most important one is the American Society of Toxicology. This is a premier group. I've been a member for, I think, 15 years. They're a large group, and they're very concerned with how toxicology is used.
I'm sorry, which one was that?
That's the Society of Toxicology.
Okay.
Another one that I'm proud to be a member of is the Society of Toxicologic Pathologists. That, like the Society of Toxicology, you have to meet certain criteria before you're allowed to join the society, and I was recently accepted into the membership of the SOTP. I'm a member of other societies too, and some of these are simply pay your dues, and others are a little bit of a cross between the two.
Now, this Society of Toxicologic Pathologists, you're not actually a board-certified pathologist, are you?
No, I'm not a pathologist. I'm not able to look down microscopes and make diagnoses. However, over the years that I've been performing inhalation toxicology, I've obtained a good working knowledge of the rat respiratory tract and know my way around it, and was asked by the SOTP to provide documentation of my skills as an associate pathologist, and they accepted those, and I was accepted into their membership 6 months ago, something like that.
Doctor, another thing here that you list yourself as a reviewer for several toxicology journals, and I think the jury has also heard from various witnesses about what being a reviewer means, so you don't need to go into that. Just tell them, please, which journals you are or have been a reviewer for, to the extent that you can remember, of course.
Over the years, I've reviewed manuscripts for a number of toxicological journals. The main one is a journal called Inhalation Toxicology, where I'm on the editorial board. I get submitted papers on a regular basis by the editor. I've also reviewed manuscripts submitted to Fundamental and Applied Toxicology, Toxicology and Applied Pharmacology, the journal Toxicology, and I'm sure there are others.
The only other one I see on here is the American Industrial Hygiene Association.
Thank you.
Journal.
That's right.
And I counted 42 or 43 publications on your resume. Does that sound about right?
Sounds about right.
How many of those are in peer-reviewed journals?
They all
are. And would it be accurate to say that the bulk of those 42 or 43 publications in peer-reviewed journals have to do with tobacco smoke inhalation work with animals?
Yes, that's true.
Now, I think the only other point I had a question for on your resume, Doctor, is this category that I don't believe we've heard about yet, posters. You list 28, something like that, posters. What are posters?
Posters are a relatively new way for scientists to present their work to other scientists. Instead of writing a long paper or making a platform presentation, the Society of Toxicology in particular encourages the use of posters where I would write a paper and pin it up onto sheets of paper and attach it to something perhaps twice the size of this poster board here. I would then stand beside it at a Society of Toxicology meeting, and my peers, my fellow scientists, would pass by. They would stop and talk and discuss and review the paper, the poster, with me. And it's a very good way to enter into a rapport with your colleagues because it's very informal. And I contend that posters really are peer-reviewed because if somebody disagrees with your work or your findings, he'd come along and say, I disagree with you and you've made a mistake here. And that's the way we're tending to do a lot of our research these days.
Thank you. Now, if you will, tell the jury about what your work history was from the time you got your PhD until you went to work for Lorillard last December. I'm not talking about describing all your duties. I just mean, who did you go to work for and what were your job titles?
I obtained my PhD in 1976. I immediately was hired by the Battelle Memorial Institute in Geneva, Switzerland. I moved to Switzerland from Scotland and stayed there until approximately May or June of '85.
In what capacity?
I started as a scientist in the program that was existing there, a tobacco research program, and when I left I was manager of the tobacco research program at Battelle, Geneva.
Okay, that takes us up to 85.
That takes us to 85. In August of 85, I joined the RJ Reynolds Tobacco Company in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and was there until November 1996, and my position when I left was principal scientist.
And when you went to Lorillard, since that's just 9 months ago, I assume that's the same position that you have now, vice president or senior vice president?
Senior vice president, yes, that's right.
All right, now let's go back to the beginnings with Battelle. Is that an independent laboratory?
Battelle is a contract research lab. They are based in Columbus, Ohio, but have labs spread throughout the world. And I was hired by the Geneva branch, yes.
At the time you went to work in the Geneva branch, in addition to the Columbus, Ohio location, what other locations did Battelle have?
Battelle at the time had a big lab in Frankfurt, Germany, and another lab in Richland, Washington State.
Here in the States?
Here in the States.
Does Battelle do government work, that is, work for the government of the United States, for example, in addition to working for private industry?
The Battelle lab I worked for could not work for the government because they were living in Switzerland and the Swiss people said you can't work for the US government. However, the two labs in the States, that is in Columbus, Ohio and in Richland, Washington, do a lot of contract work for the government.
And the Swiss lab could do work for the Swiss government?
That's right, and I'm not sure about the German lab.
All right, then I think perhaps at this point you might give us a summary of the work that you did at Battelle.
When I arrived there in January of 1976, there was a large program ongoing for a British tobacco company called Gallagher.
Called what?
Gallagher.
G-A-L-L-A-H-E-R?
G-A-L-L-A-H-E-R. This research program was understaffed. The sponsors immediately asked if I could join the group and help them in this work.
Do smoke inhalation work while you were at Battelle?
Did a number of smoke inhalation studies, yes.
Did you have the freedom to publish those studies?
Yes, we did.
And did you publish them?
Yes, I did.
Are they in your resume?
Yes, they are.
All right. Did Battelle or Gallagher or anyone else ever try to stop you from publishing the animal studies that you did while you were at Battelle?
No, they did not.
Now, please, a little more specifically, tell the jury what sort of animal smoke inhalation work you did at Battelle.
The vast bulk of the work involved rats. There are a number of reasons for this. We did occasionally use mice, but the vast majority of the work involved rodents. We did not do any work with anything larger than perhaps a guinea pig. We didn't do any dog work. We didn't do any primate work. So very largely rats only.
And give us some idea of the number of inhalation tests that you did, or inhalation studies.
Oh, dozens and dozens.
And how about duration, length of time? How long were these studies?
They would go from very short 1-hour acute exposures to several weeks to many months. I think the longest study we did excuse me, was of 18 months duration, 7 days a week, which is about the length of the rat life. It was a lifetime study in the rat.
And do I understand that you exposed these animals to mainstream smoke? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, we designed a smoking machine that generates large amounts of fresh mainstream smoke, and we exposed animals to this fresh mainstream smoke.
How many animals did you use in these tests typically?
Oh, a typical experiment might use 300 to 400 rats.
Okay. Tell the jury then, just give them an overview of what sort of results you got. Let me back up a minute. I assume that when you finished the exposure period, you'd examine the animals to see what the effects were of the exposure to smoke. Is that fair?
Yes, the standard toxicological profile would be that when you come to the end of the experiment, you put the animals to sleep, you examine the tissues with a microscope, and you see what kind of changes have been produced, largely in the respiratory tract, but quite often you'd look in other organs as well.
Okay. And tell the jury what kind of results you got with these tests.
The changes that we produced as a result of this cigarette smoke exposure were largely involved in the lining of the respiratory tract. If you think of the respiratory tract as a series of branching tubes, the lining of the tube, the inner lining of the tube, which we call the epithelium, this is the site of most of the changes. So from the nose, through the voice box, through the windpipe, conducting airways, and down into the deep lung, the lining of the tract, the epithelium, was where we saw the changes, with one minor exception, which would be in the deep lung you have free cells called macrophages. And these macrophages operate rather like Pac-Man. They go around and gobble up tissue that has got down to the lung and then clear it out of the lungs. So that's really the only change that was not in the epithelium or lining, and that's this macrophage or Pac-Man kind of response in the deep lung.
Is that a defense mechanism, the macrophage?
Yes, we saw increased numbers of these macrophages. We saw them clumping material together, showing that the defense apparatus of the deep lung was in fact working.
All right, now you talked about some changes in the epithelium, if I understand it. Tell us specifically what those changes were.
So the epithelium...
If you have to use technical terms, that's all right. I'll ask you what they mean. So
okay.
Go on and explain.
The epithelium is a lining, and it's composed of cells, individual cells that are clumped together, and these cells are of many different types. For example, in the lung, I think there are more than 20 different types of cell lining this epithelium. So the changes that we saw from the nose, I say voice box, windpipe, and everything else, were really 3, perhaps 4 changes. The first would be a term called hypertrophy, which just means that these cells lining consisting in the epithelium just got bigger. Instead of being a small cell, they were a larger cell. And that would be termed, a hypertrophy. The next change that we saw, and this is kind of getting a little bit more in a series of events that are getting more marked in terms of changes, would be a hyperplasia. And this would mean the same size cell, but more of them. So this lining just increased in the number of cells on the lining, and that's kind of like a callus. You know, in your hand, if you do a lot of manual labor with a hammer or something like that, you get calluses on here. That's kind of the change that a hyperplasia is. And then the third main change, which again is increasing in severity, is a word called metaplasia. Metaplasia means a change in the cell type, rather like a wound. Cut yourself shaving, that little scab that would form is a metaplasia. It's a change in cell type. And the main change in cell type, again, was we saw something in the voice box where we saw a kind of thickening in the voice box, but also in the deep lung we saw increased numbers of cells called goblet cells. So the conventional cell changed into a cell called a goblet cell. The goblet cells secrete mucus, just fluid, into the lung and keep the lung moist. So when you expose animals, we got more hypertrophy, we got more hyperplasia, and we got more metaplasia.
Now, with the longer studies you did, like the lifetime study you were talking about, or any of the others, did you examine animals at different stages of exposure to smoke to see if those conditions that you're describing, the hypertrophy, the hyperplasia, the metaplasia, to see when that was first occurring and to see if it was getting more pronounced or more extreme as time went on?
I think in some experiments we did. We put animals to sleep at different stages of the experiment, and I can't remember exactly what the stages were, but we could tell from that whether a change that arrived, say, after 3 months, 6 months, did it progress when you looked at animals at 6 months and 9 months and 12 months
and what did you
18
find?
months. And basically, you do get an increase in these changes. You get more hypertrophy, more hyperplasia, up to about 90 days, 3 months. And from 3 months on, the changes pretty well go up, and they pretty well stay constant. There's no real progression in the hypertrophy, the hyperplasia, the metaplasia, after about 3 months of exposure.
Did you find anything that you considered evidence that these conditions were progressing toward lung cancer? That is, we're becoming more marked and we're moving toward what might later become lung cancer?
Definitely not.
How do you know the animals? How do you know these animals were actually breathing the smoke that you intended them to breathe, getting it into their lungs?
Two main ways. One was the method I was describing to you earlier, where we were interested in what the effect smoke had on the way the animals breathe. And what we did was we used a device, a very complicated device, called a pneumotachograph, and I'll spell that for you. And then in conjunction with that, we used a plethysmograph. Basically, we put these animals and we said, how much does their breathing frequency change when you give them smoke? How many breaths do they take per minute? And then we said, how much does their tidal volume change? That's how big a breath you take. And so we could very carefully demonstrate that animals did indeed continue to breathe when they were presented with smoke. The second method was that we can take blood samples from these animals without having to put them to sleep. We can take a small blood sample, we can analyze that and see whether or not this blood sample contains any of the smoke components that they have been presented with. And the main one is a material called carbon monoxide. That's the stuff that'll kill you if you don't look after your paraffin heater. In the same way, you can look at these blood samples to see if the carbon monoxide from the smoke was getting across the lungs and into the blood. And we showed very clearly that large amounts of this carbon monoxide were getting across the lung into the blood, and we could measure that to prove that the animals were in fact inhaling large amounts of smoke.
Now, did you bring with you one of these rat tubes that you told me about in our preparation?
Yes, I did.
I want you to show that to the jury, but
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. clean, it's clean.
No stains.
Dr. Coggins, I show you a marked defense company identification. Ask you if that's identical to the sort of rat tube that you were using in your experiments at Battelle.
Yes, it is.
All right. Now, would you explain how that is used and why to the jury?
Yes, indeed. In fact, I should have mentioned earlier, when we're performing these experiments with rats, the welfare of these animals is absolutely critical to us. We have veterinarians on staff. We want to make sure that these animals are not maltreated in any way, that they're not stressed in any way. And the reason for that is that some of these diseases that have been associated with smoking are related to stress. So we wanted to minimize the stress that these animals were subjected to. And so we designed this tube to make sure that the animals were not stressed in the way they had to be restrained to provide smoke to them. They have to be restrained because they find the smoke quite irritating and try and move away from it. So the way this polycarbonate tube was made is we looked basically at the shape of the rat and tried to design a tube that would fit around the outside of it. I've seen other people use Coca-Cola tubes and stuff like that. This is a sophisticated apparatus that basically there's a slider in the back. The rat is slid in here, so the nose protrudes at this end. The tail hangs out. The tail hanging out is quite important because that's the way rats maintain their body temperature. The tail would hang out here. There's a ventilation hole here. And there's a channel in the back here for the urine to seep away from the animal, so they're not sitting in their own urine. And so this is a very sophisticated way of exposing animals at the same time minimizing their stress of exposure and maintaining good body temperature.
Is that the kind of device that's used for inhalation studies with rodents now in both government and private laboratories throughout the world?
This kind of nose-only apparatus is used for a variety of testing purposes for inhalation, especially when you have very small materials of your test compound. For example, pharmaceutical companies use this when they're testing small amounts of their pharmaceutical. So they're in common use for inhalation studies throughout the world, yes.
And are rats nose breathers?
The rat can only breathe through the nose. They can't mouth breathe like we can. When we exercise and start to breathe through our mouths, rats can't do that. So they have to breathe through the nose. And the way the smoking machine is set up is that there's a supply of smoke to the animal, and then because we don't want the rat next door to inhale the exhaled smoke from this animal, because clearly that's very different, there's a second hole in the smoking machine over here. So there's a supply of smoke and an extraction of smoke. So this animal gets clean, fresh, mainstream smoke, and no exhaled mainstream smoke from the adjacent animal.
Why did you use rats instead of some other animal?
There's a very large database on the use of rats in inhalation studies, and that was the main reason. There are other species available to us. The rat is clearly the model that is the default, if you like, in inhalation studies. And
I'm sorry.
it's clearly the default. It's the standard that most inhalation studies today are done with rats. There are studies that are being done with mice. That's usually the second species that's been done.
Well, is the respiratory tract system on the rat similar or different than that in man?
Well, once you get past the nose, it's very, very similar. The rat nose clearly is quite different. The rat nose might extend that far in the tube. The rat nose is clearly quite different to the human nose. But once you get past the rat nose, the respiratory tract is quite similar to that of the human.
All right, now referring again then to the results that you've already described to the jury of your animal inhalation studies, did you compare those results to literature published from anywhere in the world on the same subject, that is, smoke inhalation studies on animals.
Yes, we looked at the results of our studies and compared them with other published work, and indeed made those comparisons in our published work.
And how did you find that they compared in terms of results?
They were very much the same. We found pretty well what everybody else has found with smoke inhalation studies.
Now, I want to go to the next, to your next job, Dr. Coggins. When you left Battelle, did you go straight to Reynolds?
When I left Battelle, I had a month's vacation, but then I went straight to Reynolds.
All right. How did you get the RJ Reynolds job offer?
They came to me, approached me because of my published history on my publications. They came to me and said that they were interested in hiring me. I went and told my boss in Geneva and tried to get a deal with him, but he couldn't really do anything for me, so I accepted the Reynolds offer.
A promotion, in effect?
Yes, in fact, a promotion, yes.
Now, when you got to RJ Reynolds, did you do mainstream smoke inhalation animal studies there?
Yes, I did.
All right. Tell us about that.
When I arrived at RJ Reynolds, I found that they were doing some interesting research on a kind of cigarette that didn't burn tobacco. The way that conventional cigarettes burn cigarettes is that the tobacco is lit at the front, and as this tobacco is burnt, it generates heat, which releases the flavors from the tobacco closer to the smoker. Reynolds had come up with an interesting concept. Instead of burning tobacco, they had a tiny piece of charcoal in the front end of the cigarette. That was the only part of the cigarette that burned, and therefore the tobacco, instead of being burned, was only heated. And so I was very involved in a number of inhalation studies comparing this cigarette that heated tobacco with the conventional cigarette that burned tobacco.
And with respect to those animal inhalation, oh, excuse me just a minute, is that the Premier project? The jury's heard about Premier cigarette.
This was the cigarette that eventually came to be known as Premier.
Okay. Now, with respect to that animal inhalation work involving Premier, did you compare the effects on the animals from inhalation of mainstream smoke with Premier to inhalation of smoke from other cigarettes?
Yes, exactly. In each of these studies, we had a Premier cigarette, which we called test, and we would have a reference cigarette, which we called reference, and we compared the responses at the different exposure conditions that we used, yes.
And did you get differences in the effects?
We got substantial differences in the effects, yes.
And tell the jury what those
The reference animals, the animals exposed to cigarettes that burnt tobacco, had very much the same set of responses that I just described to you: hypertrophy, hyperplasia, metaplasia.
Could you slow down?
I'm sorry. The reference animals showed the same kind of responses that I just described to you. That is, hyperplasia, hypertrophy, and metaplasia of the epithelium lining the respiratory tract.
You're talking about the results you got with your animal work at Battelle.
No, I'm sorry. I'm talking about the reference animals at Reynolds. So I'm comparing. These were very much the same kind of responses.
Okay.
Tobacco burning cigarettes, whether it's Reynolds or Battelle, produced very much the same kind of response.
Okay.
The cigarettes that only heated tobacco basically didn't show anything at all. They were very similar to the controls. In fact, the pathologist, the guy who looks down the microscope, said, "You know, I can hardly tell the difference between the high exposure Premier group and the group exposed only to clean, fresh air."
Now, with respect to both categories, that is the animals that you had inhaling mainstream smoke from burning cigarettes, and with respect to the animals inhaling smoke from the heated cigarette, the Premier, did you get any indication of lung tumors, any malignancy, any cancer in the lung of either category?
No, we did not.
Did you compare your results again to the world's literature on inhalation, animal inhalation studies?
Clearly, we could only compare the work with the tobacco that was burned because nobody else had done any work with tobacco that was only heated. But yes, we did make that comparison.
And again, were the results consistent with the reported literature?
They were very consistent with what has been published in the literature.
Did R.J. Reynolds allow you to publish your work?
Yes, they did.
Again, Doctor, are those publications reflected in your curriculum vitae?
Yes, they are.
And are they in peer-reviewed journals?
Yes, they are.
Did the Premier product become a brand on the market?
The name Premier is the brand. It was in test market in, I think, 3 cities in the mid-'80s.
Was it rejected by smokers in the market testing?
I'm not sure what happened to it. We were told that the project had been cancelled and we didn't know what really happened to it.
I see a reference in your testing publications while you were at Reynolds to hamsters. And we've had a good bit of testimony here about hamsters. I want to ask you your opinion as to whether hamsters are good test models for animal inhalation work.
I don't think that they are.
Why not?
I think there's lots of problems with the use of hamsters. One is the fact that they are extremely prone to disease, that you can't tell if the responses you have produced are due to your test treatment or whether it's due to the infection of the animal or perhaps the treatment of the infection of the animal. Some of those diseases are transmissible to man, so I don't particularly want to work with them. And in fact, today, inhalation studies with hamsters are extremely rare, very much overshadowed by the fact that today it's rats and mice that are used.
So why was this hamster work done at Reynolds or by Reynolds?
The hamster work was done by Reynolds.
Excuse me, just a minute. I may have created confusion. I'm looking at a Weiner, Rennie, Greenspan, and so forth study. You know the one I'm talking about?
Yes, I do.
And it refers to inhalation, bioassay, and hamsters. Was that done in-house or outside?
That was done out of house.
Okay. Why did Reynolds have work done outside on hamsters if the model is no good?
There are really 2 questions there. We did a lot of work out-house in both rats and hamsters to show that we weren't in any way fixing the results. We were getting another independent lab to confirm our findings with rats. We attempted to do a study with hamsters and failed, and the reason we decided to do a study with hamsters was that we were concerned that our critics might say, why didn't you do a study with hamsters? So we tried to perform one in-house. We could not do it. And so we decided to take this work to a lab that had experience with hamsters, and that's the reason why it appears in my CV.
Are you aware of any hamster studies in the literature anywhere in the world that report lung tumors or lung cancers in the hamsters from inhalation of tobacco smoke?
No, I'm not.
How do you know that the rats that you tested at Battelle and the rats you tested at RJ Reynolds could even get lung cancer if you expose them to some sort of foreign substance?
Rats do get lung cancer. There's a reasonable body of evidence showing, for example, that rats exposed to diesel exhaust will get lung cancer. Rats exposed to materials like asbestos will get lung cancer. In fact, the lab that I worked in Geneva, I was on the 2nd floor with the tobacco work. On the 1st floor, they had a diesel experiment, and they produced diesel in those rats.
Produced diesel?
Produced lung tumors in animals exposed to diesel exhaust.
And what about ozone?
Ozone has not, to my knowledge, been shown to produce lung cancer in rats, but I do know that it has been shown to produce lung tumors in mice.
Have you published the mainstream smoke animal inhalation work that you've done at Reynolds? I may have asked you that.
Yes, you did.
And have you kept yourself informed right up to today on the world's literature concerning animal inhalation studies with smoke?
Very much so with smoke, and to a certain extent with other materials. I've kept myself aware of the world's published literature, yes.
All right, Doctor, based upon your education and training and experience, including the animal inhalation studies that you have done, and including your review of the animal inhalation studies throughout the world with smoke, do you have an opinion based upon reasonable scientific certainty as to whether the animal inhalation studies on smoke provide scientific evidence that cigarette smoke causes lung cancer in humans?
Your Honor, we would object, and I guess we should approach.
Yeah, I guess so.
Doctor, I'm going to ask you a question. Based upon your training experience and your animal inhalation smoke studies and RJ Reynolds, and based upon your familiarity with the world's animal inhalation studies on smoke, do you have an opinion based upon reasonable scientific certainty as to whether that work provides scientific evidence that cigarette smoke causes lung cancer in humans?
Yes, I do have an opinion.
What is that opinion?
It does not provide such evidence.
Why not?
The animal studies just do not show lung cancer. That a variety of different species, a variety of different durations, and large numbers of studies have just not shown increased rates of lung tumors in animals so exposed.
All right. Now, I want to change topics. We've been talking about cigarette smoke. Now I'm going to ask you about environmental tobacco smoke. Have you done environmental tobacco smoke inhalation work with animals?
Yes, I have.
All right. Tell us what that is, what you did.
There's a slight caveat there that instead of using environmental tobacco smoke, which is composed of aged and diluted side stream smoke, that's the smoke that comes from the tip of the cigarette, plus aged and diluted exhaled mainstream, which is the smoke exhaled by the smoker, our work could only use aged and diluted side stream smoke. For logistic reasons, we couldn't have large numbers of smokers generating mainstream smoke, and also the smoke that is exhaled by smokers is very variable. And as it's a relatively small component of the overall ETS, environmental tobacco smoke mix, we only used aged and diluted side stream smoke.
And who were you working for when you did this?
This was work I did in the late 80s, early 90s for RJ Reynolds.
All right. Now, when you started that work, was there any reported literature on environmental tobacco smoke or aged and diluted side stream smoke inhalation work with animals? Anything published anywhere?
No, there was not. We were the first.
How many tests did you do?
We did 2 experiments with aged and diluted side stream smoke. We did a 14-day study, which was 14 consecutive days, and we did a 90-day study, which was 5 days a week, so that was only 65 exposure days.
All right, let me interrupt you for a minute. I think at this point, if you can, I've got an easel there behind you, Doctor, and if you can show the jury what you did, what your results were, why don't you do that? And I put a marker there on
Thank you.
on the easel too.
There we go. So we performed 2 experiments of 6 hours per day, exposure to ADSS. One experiment had 14 days in 14, which was called a 14-day study, and we followed that with a 90-day study, which is 65 exposure days in 90. And in each of these experiments, we used 3 different concentrations of ADSS, this replacement for ETS, plus controls. So I was going to draw these for you.
And let me just interrupt you for a minute. Why did you use 3 different doses?
You need at least 3 to be able to draw a straight line through them to see what kind of dose-response relationship you get. You can do some kind of straight line with 2 points. 3 is much better, so that you can say at what dose would you predict what response. Obviously 4 would be better still, but 3 was all we could handle logistically.
And how many animals did you use?
Each exposure group had 96 rats in it.
Okay.
So the control group were exposed only to pure, filtered, super-duper air, which was clearly a concentration of 0. The next group we exposed was a little higher, and this was 1/10 of a milligram per cubic meter of ADSS. That's 1/10 of a milligram. A cubic meter is sort of a box, a yard by a yard by a yard, and a milligram is 1,000th of a gram, and there's about a gram in, say, a bag of equal or something like that. So 1/10 of a bag of equal spread over a cubic meter was this concentration here. And at the time, I was told that that was a realistic ETS concentration in areas where smoking was allowed.
Who told you that?
This was Dr. Mike Ogden from RJ Reynolds.
Yeah, you know he's testified in this case. Really.
He told me at the time we were designing these experiments that that was realistic. I think he and others would now say that that was probably an error, and that this is probably an overestimate of a real-world ETS concentration, perhaps 3 to 4 times exaggeration. But at the time, we just didn't know. So that was our low group, perhaps 3, perhaps 4 times a real-world group.
Well, in any event, if I understand correctly, at the time you made that selection for the first exposed group, the 0 is the control group. They're not getting any smoke?
Yes.
Okay. Then with the first choice on exposed group, you thought that was a real-world kind of ETS situation?
That's what we
All
thought.
right, excuse me, go ahead.
So the second group was 10 times that, which would be 1 milligram per cubic meter. Now, this is the sort of concentration you'd never see in the real world. Under realistic conditions, it's a very, very smoky environment. This clearly would be 30 to 40 times the real world.
At the time, you thought it was 10 times real.
Right. So now we think it's 30 to 40 times higher. So a pretty significant exaggeration of the kind of ETF concentration you'd see in places where smoking is allowed. So we did 0, we did 1/10, we did 1, and then we did, in an exposure group at the end, we did 10 milligrams per cubic meter, which would be 300 to 400 times a real-world exaggeration. 6 hours a day for 65 days or for 14 days.
Okay, so what results did you get? What results did you get, excuse me?
Well, clearly, the results that we got were all compared to this group, so we didn't see anything in this group at all. We looked, before I answer that part of the question, we, I keep saying we, there's a lot of scientists involved in this work. The pathologists who looked at the lung tissues, the nose tissues, did not know which treatment group he was looking at when he looked at them. There's a kind of bias in his mind. We did not let him know what group he was looking at. So we mixed the slides up, and he evaluated them and then said, attached scores to the kind of changes. We then unmixed them, and these are the unmixed results I'm going to show you now.
And how many, is this one pathologist that's looking at?
In the 14-day study, we used 1 pathologist. In the 90-day study, we used 2, and their agreement was almost complete.
Well, in the 90-day study, we used 2. Did each pathologist look at all of the slides?
Yes.
All right, excuse me, go ahead.
Right. So, in the low exposure group, we looked, as I described earlier, nasal passages, voice box, windpipe. We didn't see anything at all. It was just completely clean. And
No hypertrophy, no metaplasia, no hyperplasia, no changes.
none of those changes.
All right, go ahead.
The mid group, this 30 to 40 times, 6 hours a day. I do need to point out, keep getting to myself, none of the animals died. None of the animals lost weight. They kept gaining weight. There was no deaths, which is an important toxicological endpoint in itself. But anyway, in this group, we saw nothing at all. They had been exposed to 30 to 40 times real world, 6 hours a day for 65 days. We just didn't see anything at all. Then we get to this group, the 10 milligrams per cubic meter. This is a very dense aerosol. You could see through the chamber, but it was difficult to see. It was very difficult to see through. And in this group, we then looked at the lungs. Didn't see anything. Moved up and looked at windpipe. Didn't see anything. We move up even further and looked at the voice box. Didn't see anything. Looked in the nose. Now the nose, as I explained earlier to you, the nose in the rat is actually quite long. So we looked at the back part of the nose, the rear. Didn't see anything. It's only when we looked at the very front, very tip of the rat nose, did we see a change. And that change was the hyperplasia or the callus that, as I explained to you earlier, right at the very tip, in a certain part of the nose. It wasn't all the way around, it was just a very small portion of the rat nose. We saw this epithelial hyperplasia, is a technical term.
Is that the callus kind of description you were making earlier? Now, is that callus change in the tip of the nose, is that a permanent condition?
No. What we did in this 65 days was the thing you just described earlier. We put animals to sleep at different time points. So we looked at them after 5 days, 14 days, 28 days, 90, obviously, in the 65. And then we kept a few animals for 90 days without treatment to see if that change was still there. So I'm now talking about this change, the callus in the nose was present. We know after 90 days. It was also present after 5, It was present after 14, it was present after 28 days. It was not present after 180. It went away completely.
Did it become more marked or more severe, more extreme at any time during the exposure period once it had appeared at 5 days?
No, this is the same as this, is the same as this, is the same as this. There is no progression of this change. So the change was there by 5 days. We don't know when, maybe 3 or 4, we don't know quite when, but from then it did not progress in terms of size, in terms of severity. It did not progress in terms of going further back in the lung. It stayed right at the very tip, back of the nose. It was only present at the very tip of the nose. It did not change in severity, and it was, as I just said, completely reversible.
Did you see anything in that environmental tobacco, or that age-diluted side stream smoke testing that looked like it might be progressing toward a lung tumor or lung cancer?
No, we didn't. And one extra endpoint that we built into this experiment allowed us a very sophisticated view of that. And that when the pathologist looks at these slides, he can look at the tissues and say, yes, there's a callus, yes, there's a hypertrophy. But one of the theories of lung carcinogenesis is that you have an increased rate of the way tissues change, or build up, or proliferate. In this experiment, we've added another endpoint called cell proliferation. And this is a very sophisticated technique. We took some of these 96 animals, treated them in a special way, and instead of looking at the pathologist, well, it was the same pathologist, but we looked at the tissues in a slightly different way. The cells, if they're going through a rapid phase of proliferation, which we think is one of the prior stages of lung cancer, or indeed of any cancer, they appear to turn red when you apply a certain dye. Rather like the turkey baster, when it's done, the little button pops up and says, hey, I'm done. If these cells are proliferating at a rapid rate, they turn red, and you could say, cell proliferation is going on here at an abnormal rate. We did not see that in any of the tissues, same as this. Nothing. We did see a small proliferative change in this group here. We saw it here and here and here, but it appeared to go down in severity rather than go up. And we did not see it at the 180-day change. So we had no evidence of a proliferative change that could result in anything related to neoplastic or pre-cancerous.
What'd you do with the tissue samples that you showed the pathologists? After you were through with them?
We decided that other groups of scientists might be interested to look at these. And so rather than keep them in our labs, I keep saying our because it was a team, I decided to donate these tissues to a central group that would look after them, that would store them, and that would allow other people to come in and look at them if they wanted. And the group we chose, the largest group, is called the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. And they hold millions of tissues from humans and from animals, treated in any number of different ways. So if you have the right bona fides or the right qualifications, you can go to the AFIP and say, I want to look at the Reynolds rat study, and then they'll let you in.
You can take your seat, Doctor. Thank you. Just about 5 minutes, Judge, and I'll be through.
No, go ahead.
Did you check these results with, and back up. You said that when you started doing this work, there wasn't any reported literature on exposing animals to ETS or an ETS substitute, right? And I assume there was something in the literature after you finished.
There are a few papers that have appeared since then, yes.
All right, and have you compared your results with other studies done?
Yes, we have.
And do you find your results to be consistent?
They are very generally consistent. One lab in Germany reported a slight change in the voice box, but they used a much higher concentration. One difficulty in making that comparison, and this brings us back to my exhibit, is that these animals were not exposed in, these animals are exposed in large chambers because that's what is required to produce the aged and diluted side stream smoke. When you just put animals into big cages like that, they get lots of cigarette smoke deposited on their skin, on their fur. And when they finish being exposed at the end of the day, they lick that off and they eat it. And the other labs that have performed this kind of work, I think, without exception, have tended to use this kind of exposure, so that they're having a problem in that these animals are eating large amounts of cigarette smoke, and some of it may even be being absorbed through the skin. I think nicotine goes through skin. So we wanted to avoid that contamination of the animals, so we put animals in these tubes and then put the tube inside the chamber, so that the animals had minimal exposure of smoke through skin or through being deposited on the fur and then subsequently being eaten. So, in a way, that's one of the problems in inhalation. Because the other labs didn't do that, can we really compare them? But we did compare them, and we have very much the same set of results.
Did you publish your animal work that you've just been describing?
Yes, we did.
And again, are those publications on your resume?
Yes, they are.
Okay. Now, based, Doctor, upon your animal inhalation experiments with this age-diluted side stream smoke, substitute, as you said, for ETS, based upon your education and training and experience and your familiarity with the world's literature on other environmental tobacco smoke type inhalation studies with animals, do you have an opinion based upon reasonable scientific certainty as to whether that animal work provides scientific evidence that environmental tobacco smoke causes lung cancer in humans?
Yes, I do.
And what is that opinion?
Same objection for honest.
And what is that opinion?
That it does not provide such evidence.
And why do you say that?
Because of the complete lack of lung response, even under extreme conditions, very, very high concentrations of smoke, for considerable periods of time, even using this sensitive, highly sensitive cell proliferation assay in the lungs, we did not see any response whatsoever.
All right, would you give me just one more? Excuse me just a minute, Doctor.
Sure.
I don't know whether I asked this question. May I approach that? I think you testified about this exposure level. Is there any circumstance under which people would ever be exposed to this last level of 10 milligrams per cubic meter?
I think it's extremely unlikely that if they did encounter that kind of smoke, they would immediately run. They would not be there. I don't think you'd ever encounter it, but if you did, you would not be able to stay there for very long at all.
And how about with this smaller one of 30 to 40 times?
I've seen a couple of papers in places like billiard halls where it's approached about 0.7. I have not seen a figure as high
This
as
is 1?
Yeah, I've never seen a figure as high as 1.
Thank you, Doctor. That's all I have.
I assume that your costs will be a little bit lengthy, so let's go ahead and take a lunch break now at 12:15. Get back at 1:30, folks. 1:30. Just a moment, Doctor. That's all right,
Thank you.
just leave it on the floor, Jim. Thank you, sir. That's fine, just wait. We'll work it out. During the lunch break, you're free to do whatever you want to for lunch, but you cannot discuss your testimony with anybody, including the lawyers of either side.
I understand. Okay. Thank you.
All right, we'll be back at 1:30.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, he had to.
We're not going to use that. You can just give it back.
This thing?
Not that, that's the other.
I figured I'd come and get it. Yeah, those are children. Okay, I'll be there in a second. He reused it.